few years ago, we started a coalition called the National Coalition to Combat Police Terrorism, in which uh, you chaired, along with our sister, former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, and I was the coordinator for that particular piece. Um, the wild thing about it, it seems like it's needed more now than ever. You know, what are your thoughts on reinstituting it and bringing that thing back? Because I think that at the stage when I think that although the police were murdering and have been murdering us for the last 500 years plus, right? I think that at that particular moment, a lot flew over a lot of folks' heads, because it's like, and I remember the press conferences. Oh, you a coalition to combat police terrorism. You had to explain what combat was, so on and so forth, in the terms of the enemy. So I wanted to ask you your thoughts on it, and how important is a national coalition to combat police terrorism in these days?
Well, I think it's absolutely important. I think that should be a component of a national united front against fascism. Plenty of people ask me what the legacy of the Black Panther Party was, the original Black Panther Party. I'm not talking about the Black Panther Party of Elaine Brown and that crew. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the original Black Panther Party from 1966 to 1971. And at that time, the Black Panther Party, because it was one of the leading African formations on the continent, in North America, and because there was a huge anti-war sentiment in the U.S., and the white students and white activists all across the U.S. Understood that the U.S. involvement in Vietnam was the involvement of an imperialist nature. They understood that they wanted peace and not war. They wanted to dismantle the war machine. They wanted to reconcile America's racial animus. And so the cities were burning every summer, and so the system, LBJ at that time, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was the president at that time, launched this war on poverty, launched this great society, and that was the seeds. That from that process to co-opt Black power, to co-opt Black militancy, came the Black comprador class that we have today. The poverty pimps of yesterday wound up in the Congressional Black Caucus. Martin Luther King's compatriots who were around him when he was assassinated became the Pied Pipers of Black people into the Democratic Party. Okay, and we have not benefited from that at all. But what we did at that time, we understood that the right and that white supremacy was in disarray, was in confusion after the gains in the South on the civil rights movement, after the rise as Black power began to gain credence amongst students, amongst the lumpen proletariat, unemployed. Black people on the streets were wearing Black power emblems on their hats, and Black fists on their Afro picks. So in order to co-opt this, in order to bring this down, they came up with the War on Poverty and the War on Drugs and the Omnibus Control Act in the late 1970s. But what we did in order to prevent or inhibit the consolidation of white supremacy after the gains of the civil rights movement is that we call for a united front on fascism. We call for a national united front. And 7,000 to 8,000 activists showed up to build what we call national committees to combat fascism chapters in each major city. And it's telling too, because in retrospect, what we saw was almost 80% of those activists that showed up for this united front against fascism were white. And they showed up to Black Panther convention that was convened to build a united front against the rise of the militarized police, against the rise or the reassertment of white racist conservatism in the Republican Party. The pushback against the civil rights gains of the 60s was mass incarceration, was the war on drugs and the war on terror. And it was the black bourgeoisie, the Negro black faces in high places that supported these omnibus crime control bills, that supported the Clintons, that supported these bills, that wound up putting masses of black youth in prison. So we need to understand that today it's the same comprador class, it's the same petty bourgeoisie that supports the so-called George Floyd Policing Act reform. You cannot reform the armed agents of the state, as Ajamu pointed out. The armed agents of the state are the police, are the domestic military force that they have to rely on when the masses of working people understand that the government is no longer functioning in its behalf or on its or in their interests, that they have to use force and violence, legal violence, in order to maintain their political power. And this is what's being done to the black community. We are being given the alternative between black district attorneys talking about they're going to bring charges against racist cops and a racist police culture that sees the masses of people, and black people in particular, as their enemy. You see, and how do we rein in these police in the police state? We can't reform them. We have to take power from them. We have to defend ourselves against them. We have to defend ourselves against them. We have to decertify their exceptional status in the community because they're masquerading as workers. It is the police that breaks up working class and workers' union strikes. It's the police. They're not workers. And we have to make that clear. And when we talk about international solidarity, whether it's with the Palestinian people, whether it's with the people in Africa, we have to understand that the role that these political action committees play. We have to understand that AIPAC, the American Israeli lobby, exercises more control and power over our black elected officials than we do. The police union exercise more political control over our black elected representatives than the black community does. But yet and still, AIPAC is not registered as an agent of a foreign government, Israel. The police unions are not decertified and recognized as armed agents of the state who have the power of life and death in their hands. But yet and still, they have a policeman's bill of rights. They're treated with exception whenever they murder somebody. These punks murdered a 21-year-old pregnant black woman, and most that they've got right now is a suspension pending investigation. If you and I were involved in a shooting in the community that killed someone, whether intentional or not, we would be in jail. We would be trying to get an attorney rather than the police talking about no one could talk to them for 72 hours after these incidents because they're traumatized and all of this stuff. Right. So we have to understand that when we come up with slogans like defund the police, that shows that the activists that came up with this slogan are woefully uneducated as to the role of the police in the capitalist, white supremacist America. That if they wanted to talk about anything, they should have talked about community control of public safety of the police. And they should have talked about interrupting the command chain, the political chain of command between the mayors who appoint police chiefs and putting that instead into the hands of the people. So they should have been talking about decentralization of police, not defunding the police. There's not a politician in the capitalist white supremacist America that is going to sign his or her name to a bill to defund the cops.
Right.
You see? And so just telling you that the people that came up with this idea knew that. And they knew that that idea would sound slick, it would sound revolutionary, but it would go nowhere. So all of the energy that we could have taken and used to build a consensus for community control of police and communities was dissipated, was not used. It's like Cop City. We had to wait for the city council, black faces in high places, to sign on to a corporate plot to build a training center in the middle of Atlanta. We had to wait for that. But we couldn't organize for decentralization and community control of public safety years ago when the cops was murdering us, when we had Slick Willie was the mayor, what's his name? Andrew Young and all of them Negroes and them bootlickers down there were mayors. When your homeboy, Killer Mike, was talking all that yik-yak bullshit. You see? Somebody need to... Nah, I ain't gonna say that. Anyway, I'm just saying, why didn't we organize community control of public safety? We had ability to put that on the referendum. We could elect them niggas to city council that certified Cop City. Why couldn't we elect the city council that certified decentralization of police? We could have done it. But the so-called hashtag movements, the so-called Negroes who were activists were ill-suited and ill-educated enough or insufficiently enough to bring to the attention of the black community the true role of the police in our community and why they had to be reined in. So now we have Cop City. Now we have a city council that's basically ignoring the masses of people, and they're going to go ahead with their program, and you're going to have your Cop City, and then what you going to say? Then what you going to do? You see?
So let me ask you this. Because, of course, many of our viewers, might be confused when you're saying that, Cop City could have been stopped, or there could have been a fork in it a long time ago. What do you mean by that, number one? Because you're talking about decentralization, and how do we prevent future, quote unquote, Cop Cities in places where it hasn't been established yet, in your opinion?
Well, the way we could have prevented it is, like I said, we could have organized. All politics is local. Okay, the police didn't just start killing black folks in Atlanta. The police didn't just stop, help criminal activities, supporting criminal activities in Atlanta. They didn't just start. So we could have gotten, like I said, if we revisited the past, we would have saw that in New York, for instance, we had a referendum placed on the ballot for community control of the police. But it was the union using millions of dollars that opposed this proposal, community control of the police. And they instead floated a counteroffer, which was a civilian complaint review board. And they confused the people leading up to the elections, so that said that if you wanted the civilian complaint review board, if you wanted a community control of police, vote no. And if you wanted a civilian complaint review board, vote yes. Okay? And the people were confused. And they voted for a civilian complaint review board that didn't have any power, no ability to interdict police misconduct and behavior. They had 2 appointees from the mayor's office, 2 from the police unions, and I believe 3 from the community. So you were always going to be outvoted. You were never going to have any type of clout. And so we see that civilian complaint review boards were then replicated everywhere as they killed black folks, because almost every rebellion and every so-called riot in the 60s was a result of police brutality or murder, or the rumor thereof. Every one. Okay? So they knew what would happen if the masses of people really were seriously organized, if that rage was organized into an institutional power that could enforce itself, that could make policing in the community a residency clause that, you know, a policeman comes out of the academy, he does 2 years probation. If he's assigned to a certain community, a black community, he should live in that community, or at least that probationary period, which meant that the landlords had to set aside housing and stuff for policemen and public servants. Okay, once you start to live in the community that you police, then all of this stuff that the gangbangers that evolved, you know, gangbanging from one generation to the next, where grandpa was a Crip and dad was a Crip and uncle was a Crip, and so I'm a Crip. I mean, when I was growing up gangbanging in street sets, you know, you stopped gangbanging when you were 16 years old. If you were still gangbanging after 16, you was a retard. You was retarded. Who does that? You see, you moved on to a higher level of criminality, if you want to put it that way. You became a stick-up kid, a hustler, or you became something, but you wasn't running around with colors on, repping that this is my hood. I mean, that's some. I mean, how is a street in L.A. belong to a gang when the whole of L.A. is controlled by a white motherfucking police force? How? What territory are you claiming? Huh? Crackers come in there in force, and you throw your guns all up under the car and shit. Why you about hassling me? I ain't did nothing. Huh? You ain't shooting back. You ain't holding down the hood from it. You're not even doing what they do in Brazil in the favelas. You know, at least the cops are scared to come there. They got to come there in force because they know that the gangs there ain't no joke. They just as well armed as they are. You see? So we have to really understand that there are things that we can do. We can put referendums on the ballot to decertify the police unions. I mean, you can carry out class actions to decertify the police unions, which would educate the community about the real nature and the role of the police, that would disrupt their culture of racism and white supremacy and violence aimed at us. We can put all that on display with a class action. We can also put on the referendum in our local communities, community control of public safety. And don't think that public safety just means police. Public safety also means public health care. Public safety also means the deliverance of sanitation and educational facilities to the community. All that is about the safety and livelihood of our communities. But the fact that we don't do it and haven't done it is because the energy to do that, activists have dissipated that energy into bullshit struggles around things that really are not aimed at changing the power paradigm between the community, a colonized community, and the white supremacist construct that is America.